This presentation is going to focus on epideictic rhetoric. In Gerard Hauser's text, he doesn't spend a lot of time on epideixis. I think this is primarily because Aristotle doesn't spend a lot of time on epideixis, and as a discipline, rhetoric doesn't spend a lot of time on epideixis. The crown jewel of our field is deliberative rhetoric. That is the kind of rhetoric that is really the heart and soul of managing conflict and discourse. I want to argue, though, that epideictic rhetoric is pretty central to the issues and concerns in this class with regard to an ethical rhetoric, because I think it plays a very important role in terms of developing and sustaining community. Aristotle names three species or genres of rhetoric: judicial, deliberative, and epideictic. Judicial is the rhetoric, it's sometimes called forensic, that takes place in a court environment, a legal environment. Deliberative usually takes place in a public assembly. So typically it's something that you might see Congress engaging in, or Parliament, depending on your system of government. But these are ways of talking about conflict and making choices and choosing good answers. Epideixis is rhetoric of praise and blame, or sometimes it's called ceremonial rhetoric. It often goes along with official sorts of ceremonies. In Aristotle's work, The Rhetoric, he determines genre on the basis of the role of the audience. He has a very audience motivated understanding of rhetoric. So there are a lot of things that we can think of that might shape what we would call a rhetorical event. But for Aristotle, the audience who hears it is primarily important. So the audiences, and you'll recall that both Bitzer and Hauser talk about what makes a rhetorical audience. We can be audiences who aren't present to judge, but if we are rhetorical audiences, one of the things that we do is judge. So both judicial and deliberative puts audiences in the role of judge. We listen and then we make a decision. In the case of judicial rhetoric, we make a decision based on something that happened in the past and determine it based on the principle of the law that we're looking at. In the case of deliberation, we consider the possibilities for the future. What should we do tomorrow? What is the best choice? Well, the word that Aristotle uses to describe the epideictic audience is theoros. It has sometimes been translated as spectator. However, the theoros is really the concept of audience that you would find at an artistic performance, at a play, for instance. So the audience participates in the process of being an audience. They're not completely passive. They're not simply spectators. But they are called on to make different sorts of judgments, and those judgments tend to be aesthetic judgments. So they form an active role, but they do not have a judgmental role, in the sense that they are not called on to say, we have this possibility and this possibility and this possibility, which do you choose? Or decide if I've made a good comment. Instead, it would be more aesthetic judgments. Was that said well? Was that said pleasingly? Was the aesthetic that you're trying to achieve used? Was motivation clear, etc.? The three appeals or proofs that Aristotle talks about and then that Hauser explains are pathos, ethos, and logos. Logos is rationality and really looks a lot at structure, how arguments flow. Aristotle delivers to us the first conception of formal or shaped rhetoric, argument, which is that certain premises have to follow other premises and have to result in conclusions, etc. Logic is very much playing into the shape of arguments. Do they make sense in a formal sort of way? and what kinds of patterns work. So we have this very well developed understanding of logos. Ethos is also an appeal that's centered in the speaker. That is, can the speaker himself or herself have an effect on persuasion? And that issue is credibility. Does the fact that this person has achieved great things make what they're saying more believable? How does this participate in the process? And then there's pathos, and that is centered in the audience, which is how do we get audiences to feel certain ways so that we can lead them to make certain decisions or to feel certain things. Now, for Aristotle, pathos is considered kind of concerning, and I think in our own era we worry about pathos as well. I think we tend to be, and certainly I do, very aware of being manipulated by emotional appeals. So we feel that there's something unfair in the polar bear ad, for instance, in using the polar bear, particularly when it's against its nature, looking to be a friendly, loving, vulnerable sort of individual, when in effect it's not, but also that we're being invited to buy a car on the basis of this lovable furry friend. I would argue, though, that pathos is probably the key appeal in Epideictic, although I've argued that ethos is, but it seems to me that the feeling in the audience is critical to how Epideictic succeeds or fails. The character of Epideictic, I mostly want us to think about what its nature is. What does Epideictic look like? I am not necessarily that keen on dividing discourse into genres. I don't care if something's a novel or a sort of memoir / novel. I'm not necessarily keyed in to what we call it. I think things tend to bleed into other disciplines and other genres, and I don't think it's always clear. But one of the values of knowing the nature of something is that it gives us some sort of expectation for what's going on, and it puts us in the right frame of mind as an audience. So some of the features of Epideictic is that it typically tells us what we already know. Another way of thinking about this is it typically doesn't deal in controversy or conflict, but rather on controversies and conflicts that have been resolved. We normally praise things that we already know the group approves of. In addition, it tends to exaggerate. The goal of Epideictic is to raise up a value, whether it's praise or blame, and say, look at this important value. And so it underwrites it and tells it in very large ways. And it might exaggerate in terms of visual, in terms of repetition, the many ways that we can overemphasize to make a point. In addition, it calls attention to itself. It's also called the rhetoric of display. So it wants to be understood as being, artificial in some ways. You'll often hear Epideictic speakers saying, it's good that we meet today. It's good that we praise. So you get a real meta conversation, a real awareness. And typically we call Epideictic empty, if we're going to use a negative word. But what it's empty of is argument and rational patterns. And I would argue that it's not empty, it's just full of something else. It just isn't a container for an argument. And I think it's really a little bit different than the other forms. Now, I think we need to think about why we might praise or why we blame. Why is it important to us to do this, to have ceremonies built around this process, and to do these things publicly? I think it does several things for us. It reaffirms our beliefs and values. It may be the case that we all believe that freedom is a good thing, but one view that we have is that we need to have our commitment perhaps renewed to this notion, and also to say it out loud. Think of the Pledge of Allegiance. The purpose of the Pledge of Allegiance is not to get someone to commit their allegiance to the U.S. Rather, it's an attempt to get someone to reaffirm a belief and value that the pledge assumes you already hold. In addition, by reaffirming these beliefs and values, we establish common ground. If a speaker says, we're all gathered here today to celebrate the marriage of, what that person is doing is saying, okay, I'm telling you what you already know. I'm reaffirming your beliefs and values, that marriage is a good thing, that these two people should get married. But I'm also making clear to you that all of us share this desire to do these things. We have this in common. We may have other things that are different, but in this situation, this is our common ground, and let's focus on this. We also use praise and blame to teach others how to act. So we often praise children, or maybe even punish children, more for ceremonial purposes, because it reinforces behavior that we want and makes clear behavior that we don't want. Further, this process shapes doxa and therefore shapes audiences who hear. Doxa, remember, is that collection of shared conclusions that a society has come to. So you take a lot of things that have been deliberated about and agreed on, and that becomes the doxa. That changes and shifts over time. One thing that Epideictic can do for us is make us aware of how that doxa has been shaped, and how it has changed. And in the process, it makes audiences aware. Finally, I think that one of the things that praise and blame establish are emotional states in audiences. And Aristotle said very wisely that while it's rationality that helps us make our choices, we have to have the emotional catalyst in order to spur action. And action is, for Aristotle, very important. It's actually doing, not just thinking the right thing. And he understood, and I think very insightfully, that emotion needs to be present in order for most people to act. Finally, I consider that epideixis is cultural discourse. It helps us identify who we are. So when you have platforms, Democratic platform, Tea Party platform, Republican platform, and people argue and deliberate about what the platform's going to be, and then it's presented, the purpose of presenting that platform is to say Republicans are about the following. In the process of identifying ourselves, it helps us to form communities. As you will be aware, Democrats and Republicans, by definition, have changed over time. There was a time when the word progressive was used to describe Republicans. And there's a time now when progressive is used to describe Democrats. So Republicans haven't always maintained or lived in a conservative space, but have been the people who propelled change and labor laws and that sort of thing. So because we shift in these ways, and yet the name might stay the same, it's important for us to identify and then to communicate to other people so that if they want to join, they can. I think that the Tea Party right now is very focused on epideictic rhetoric because it is in a community formation stage. I think that what they're probably weaker on is deliberation, because I don't think they have gone through this process of epideictic identification. And finally, I think that epideixis is beneficial to us because it helps us to understand other communities. If we hear other groups in their epideictic forums, it helps us to see what those groups value. And I think that it participates in this very important process of belonging to diverse cultures. Let me know if you have questions, and we can talk in class.